Okay, we're going to make a start, everyone. So I'm just going to hand over to Chloe, who is doing our next talk. She's a volunteer at ReportOUT, and she will be presenting the Out in Belize research. So over to you.
Hi everyone, thank you. Thanks for coming down here. I know some of you have had a pretty long day so far, so I appreciate that you've stuck around to see me. And in sort of post-lunch time slumps, but hopefully you'll manage to stay awake for this. But yeah, welcome to my talk. So I'm today going to be talking about Belize. We've got a project here that I've been doing with ReportOUT and some of my other team members who couldn't be here today. So please bear with me. It's just me today. But Out in Belize is a ReportOUT research investigation into the lived experiences of sexual and gender minorities in Belize. So if anyone attended the talk earlier today on Mongolia, it's very similar research structure. So I'll be talking about the lived experiences and what life is like for people in Belize. So just as I get started, really, it's really important to emphasize this is partnership working. I'm sure, as is obvious to all of you, I'm not Belizean. I've never actually been to Belize, so please bear that in mind. But it's really important for ReportOUT, as with any sort of humanitarian type work. Obviously, there's an element, we've got to be sensitive around power dynamics here. And it's really important that we instill this kind of co-production and we work with local partners in Belize. So for us, we've been working with Our Circle. This is Darisha on the bottom in the photo there. So she's our main point of contact for Our Circle. And they are a Belizean charity, so they're all volunteer run as well, like ReportOUT, and they work to support LGBTQ+ members of Belizean society. They're based in Belize City, which is not the capital, but has a really dense kind of urban population. So they work to support all sexual and gender minorities, but particularly actually family units as well. They've got an Our Circle resource centre there, so it's a bit of a community hub. So it's been really, it's been a privilege to work with them in this project and to kind of gather insights from them as well. So moving on then, so we've been working with them in this research project. We've been, for us, this is kind of, at ReportOUT, we do a lot of sort of country profiles. Belize is what we kind of think of as a bit of a deep dive into, as I said, the lived experiences of sexual and gender minorities in that country. So it's really important, obviously, to work with our partners in Belize to look at what life is like, and that includes consulting with them every step of the way. So as you can see on the board here, this is the basic structure of our research, and it's the basic structure of my talk today that I'm going to kind of talk us through. But we've done our absolute best to stay in touch with the partners we've got and get their voices into this every step of the way. So really important to integrate those kind of multiple perspectives, get their voices heard, and for them to signpost us to what those important key issues are that we can then work on together to look further into. So I thought it best really to start with some context. I don't know if anyone actually has ever heard of Belize, but quite a small country. It's located in Central America. You can see my little laser here. It borders Guatemala, very close to Mexico and El Salvador, Honduras. It's actually located on the Yucatan Peninsula as well. So in terms of its history, got a really rich Mayan civilization history there, so very ancient land, really ancient indigenous population as well. It is pretty rural. You can see the population is relatively small, and that is quite vastly distributed over sort of rural space as well. But of those that do live in urban areas, almost 30%, so almost a third of them, are actually located in Belize City. So as I mentioned earlier, talking about our circle, that's really, it's not the capital is Belmopan, but it's really kind of a cultural hub for a lot of the population. And also just to point out as well, almost 90% of Belize's population are religious, particularly Christianity, and within Christianity it's particularly Roman Catholicism as well. So as you'll see later on in the talk, there's very heavy religious influence across pretty much all aspects of society there. And that leads me on to talk about a brief history of sexual and gender minorities. So it's useful on the previous slide showing the map, because you can see how, I'll just go back onto it, you can see how close it is, obviously bordering to Mexico, Guatemala, and as I said, that those Mayan roots, the Mayan civilization, which is ancient culture, we know that there is a history of sexual and gender minorities persisting throughout that culture. So we're talking thousands and thousands of years ago, there's evidence there of a sort of gender fluidity amongst, there we go. There's a history there of gender fluidity amongst those people. And as you can actually see, this lovely picture here, this is taken from a cave. It's actually from Guatemala, the modern day borders of Guatemala, but it is in terms of the lands, Mayan land, Mayan history. This is an image of the deity called Chin, so the Mayan deity called Chin, and it shows to us that actually homosexuality, particularly between males, was almost spiritual. Not only was it normalized within society and accepted and recorded, as you can see, but almost had religious elements to it. So that's kind of the level which it was a part of life back then. As I've come to realize in doing this kind of work with ReportOUT and looking at histories of sexual and gender minorities in countries, there's a pretty heartbreaking pattern of a rich history of sexual and gender minorities that's almost becoming undone with the with European colonialism. So European colonialism, particularly in this instance, in the case of Belize, are perpetrated by Britain. So British colonialism of Belize has pretty much destroyed the tradition, destroyed those ancient acceptance of gender fluidity, of homosexuality, and instead imposed those kind of very strict dimorphic European customs and societal standards that then become ingrained into common law. So we start to see the imposition of more kind of Christian values of binary gender and the kind of idea of gender fluidity, and particularly again homosexuality, seen as more of sodomy and of as something against natural law. So heartbreaking, really, when you think of how accepted it and almost worshipped it was in society. So that also leads on to the state of Belize today in terms of its legislation and protections. Again, as with as is often the case in particularly Caribbean nations, we tend to see, but nations that have been unfortunately colonized by European nations, we start to see the imposition of European common law. And in the case of Belize, that ended up being the imposition of Section 53 in the Belizean Criminal Code, which actually criminalized homosexuality, making it illegal to be with the person you want it to be. So again, heartbreaking, really. But you can see here on the slides actually defines sex between men, specifically between men, not entirely sure why that was, but I think possibly to do with, if you think of rights between genders, just the general lack of recognition of women in state legislation. This was actually imposed in 1888. So again, think about the society at the time, but defined sex between men as carnal intercourse against the order of nature, and actually punishable with up to 10 years in prison. So that kind of gives a sense of where Belize was at as a country. There is, however, a bit of a story to this, because actually now, as of today, that is void. So in 2016, an activist called Caleb Orozco, so you can see here Orozco, the Assistant Attorney General. If you want to look more into this, I'll just briefly mention it. But Caleb Orozco is a gay activist. Sorry, he's president of the United Belize Advocacy Movement, which is known as UNIBAM. I think I put it on the side, but he comes up later. And he actually took Belize, well, the nation of Belize, he took this to court, the Section 53, and asked for it to be overturned on the grounds that, to quote him, "My worth and dignity as a human being and value as a member of society are not recognised." And he actually won this case. So he argued it was unconstitutional, and it actually ended up that the Attorney General did agree and ruled in favour of this, that Section 53 breaches constitutional rights to dignity, equality before the law, freedom of expression, privacy, and non-discrimination on grounds of sex, which officially makes, as of 2016, officially makes Section 53 unconstitutional, null and void. So that's quite a landmark point in Belize's history, particularly with sexual and gender minorities. Obviously, that means it is no longer illegal to have sex, gay sex, homosexual sex, if you like. However, there's still a long way to go. So we can see that this doesn't actually follow in other areas of national legislation. For example, there remain no discrimination protections at all for sexual and gender minorities in national legislation. So a really notable point of this, an example, is that the Belizean Immigration Act actually includes homosexuality as a cause to prohibit immigrants. So that means that in practical terms, a foreign national, so anyone not Belizean, entering the country, whether true or just perceived that they are homosexual, could be invoked by the state as a reason to deny them entry, or if they are in the country, it could be a reason to deport them. So obviously that's hugely problematic and discriminatory example there. And UNIBAM, again, Caleb Orozco's movement, actually did attend the UN Human Rights Committee in 2013 and argued that this was the case, and that it's the case that this is being enforced against gender minorities also. So it's kind of, although the wording is homosexuality, it's sexual and gender minorities. So obviously a huge class of people there being discriminated against. Possibly the kind of worst point of all of this is that this was recognised, the discriminations enabled by the lack of legislation, if you like, was recognised. And in 2020, they did actually draft an equal opportunities bill, which kind of encompassed all of these sort of problem areas in the legislation so far. And this would have essentially, well, made equal opportunities. It would have brought in discrimination protections into recognition there in national law. However, in 2020, it was withdrawn because they had extremely intense resistance to the bill. So that means that as of today, at the present moment, Belize still does not have any discrimination protections, which, as I will come to talk about, is obviously hugely problematic and really dangerous to the lives of sexual and gender minorities in Belize. And then a final point is just to say that transgender and intersex and non-binary people simply seem to just not be recognised. So again, Section 53 being overturned was a really positive moment in Belize's history in terms of allowing sort of consensual same-sex, but there's still no recognition for even the existence of transgender communities and non-binary people. So, for example, like there's no allowance for name changes, there's no gender markers. So if you imagine kind of the way that this can enforce discrimination, such as anything, paperwork, signing a house, all sorts of family law issues, such as adoption, for example, massively problematic and creates their whole existence to be taboo. So moving on then to contemporary social attitudes, this is a kind of discrepancy here, because as you've seen from the legislation, obviously the resistance to legislation, it's pretty clear that social attitudes are not where they are elsewhere in the world in terms of sexual and gender minorities. However, interestingly, when people were surveyed, sort of the general population, I should say, of Belize was surveyed, people did report their attitudes quite positive towards sexual and gender minorities. So a lot of people actually reported they were accepting of them, they were tolerable of them, they were welcome in their society, and that people should not be treated differently based on their sexual orientation. So that's really positive findings. However, seems to unfortunately massively contradict the experience of sexual and gender minorities in the country. So we know that, well, as will become apparent through our survey results, we know that unfortunately verbal, physical and emotional abuse does seem to be prevalent and commonly experienced by these communities. And also, as I'll talk a little bit about later, this was unfortunately exacerbated by the pandemic as well, by COVID-19. We think a lot of LGBT communities rely on those kind of safe spaces with friends, with trusted families. Obviously, something such as a lockdown that prevents that kind of social movement is massively disruptive to their lives, and in some cases dangerous. It can force you to stay with families who don't accept you. It can break up those communities you've built yourself. So another case, if anyone went to Drew's climate change talk, it's another example of those structural inequalities being kind of exacerbated by wider determinants and that kind of complex system of interlinking factors there. So again, that will become clearer as we go on. This is a nice quote at the bottom, by the way, out of our survey. So it come from our results, but I just thought it's just simple, isn't it? Gets the point. I want to make people Belize respect us as who we are, and I think that's the bottom line of where Belize is at, is that people are not respected and they're not accepted in society. So to look at this on kind of a larger scale then in terms of culture, religion, societal institutions, the media has played a massive role actually in propagating very negative, derogatory rhetoric, in some cases even violent towards sexual and gender minorities. So we've seen a lot of pro-heterosexual messaging coming through the newspapers, through the tabloids, which is extremely dangerous if you think of how widely circulated these papers are and how commonly they're kind of read and picked up on, how easy it is therefore to kind of ingrain it within society. This quote here in the middle is actually written by the editor-in-chief of the newspaper Amandala, which is kind of a bit like The Sun, I guess, kind of Daily Mail, really popular, well-read kind of tabloid newspaper in Belize, so quite commonly known and heard of. And you can just see from this quote the kind of violence of this rhetoric, and not only the violence, but it's actually a call to arms, kind of get up and help fight this evil in our midst. So it's not only just derogatory, it's kind of proactive in calling people to actively do something about this. So extremely dangerous and worrying, really, that this is getting printed on this kind of cultural level as well. And as well, there's examples of this coming through politics as well. So there's actually, I'll read a quote here that was said by, it's a bit of a mouthful, but the Minister of Human Development, Social Transformation and Poverty Alleviation, Anthony Martinez, actually publicly stated, completely unprovoked by the way, that his position was that God never placed anything on me for me to look at a man and jump on a man. I'll fight tooth and nail to keep that law. So he said that in reference to the Orozco Attorney General case trying to overturn Section 53 and what was essentially known as the sodomy law. So you can kind of see, like, even in the very top levels of government, you've got people publicly, unashamedly stating their position, and in terms of national legislation, you can see quite clearly why something such as the Equal Opportunities Bill just had no chance in getting passed. So yeah, culturally and societally, that's the kind of level we're at in Belize. And again, as you can kind of see from this, there's strongly religious links as well. So also what came through in Anthony Martin's quote, but God's never placed anything. There's those kind of links to natural law and that idea of Christianity coming through there. So shows the level as well that to which the church has a role in this, and in terms of the state institution, the level that religion and the church has in being a voice of resistance as well to legislation and just generally propagating that anti-sexual and gender minority narrative, I guess, that pro-heterosexual, this is natural, this is not kind of dimorphism. So yeah, it's not something, these kind of social attitudes, it's not simply coming from kind of the village elders, it's entrenched within society across all sorts of institutions right up to the highest level. And that means that there's a lot of dangers here to be faced by sexual and gender minorities, essentially coupled, these attitudes coupled with the kind of multiple discriminations and of course the actual explicit lack of discrimination protection within the legislation as well, means it's dangerous to live there. You can see, I've highlighted two examples here. So the first one is an example that kind of wider deterrent. So it's not, when we talk about dangers, you think of violence, right? But actually it's dangerous in terms of this attitude, the denial of the existence of trans people, of intersex people, for example, means that doctors aren't fully trained. So what happens when an intersex person or a transgender person or a non-binary person goes to hospital and they need urgent reproductive health care? The doctors don't know how to help them. They die. It's as simple as that. So it's not just about physical violence here, it's about across society. It's dangerous to live there if you're a sexual and gender minority, because these kind of layers of protections that cisgender heterosexual people have and take for granted are simply not there. So they're exposed to kind of multiple discriminations at once. And then of course there is the violence as well. So in the case of Ulysses Rocateri, so that's him down here, he was a gay fashion designer, so Belizean. He was HIV positive, but living with HIV, and he was arrested in 2020 for a breach of COVID-19 regulations. So there's a lot of kind of anecdotal suggestions in Belize that the police used COVID-19 rules and regulations as essentially an excuse to kind of persecute and sort of round up, if you like, sexual and gender minorities. I can't say for certain whether that's true, but make up your mind on that. But Ulysses was arrested and whilst in prison made national headlines because of the horrific physical and verbal abuse he received. So to the extent that he died from his injuries days later. So obviously really young man, really bright, promising career in fashion, died at the hands of police during his time in police custody. So officially this death was recorded as due to HIV complications. Again, make up your mind on that, but kind of goes to show, as I'll touch on later as well, the level of danger that is faced by these people and the kind of level that to which it's enshrined and essentially institutionalized. So I thought I'd bring it back up to some positives, which is, as we said, essentially Section 53 was ruled unconstitutional. So that obviously there are people in Belize, although there is a lot of resistance, there's a lot of positive work going on. There are people that are tirelessly fighting to get there. It's a long battle, but they are getting there. And then, as you can see, 2017, again, Belize held its first ever Pride event, so Belizean Pride Week, so that's really landmark as well, because this was an event for the people, by the people. So for pretty much the first time we've seen, in 2017, we've seen an organised community of people being proud and able to be out and define in that aspect. So really positive to see that. I'm really brave of them to see that too. And then in 2018, we've seen the beginnings of Belize starting to gain kind of international attention. So Belize they do the voluntary United Nations Universal Periodic Review. So they kind of sit with the UN, just go through each of the factors. And at this voluntary review, Belize acknowledged that the need to improve the situation for sexual and gender minorities. So whilst clearly there are some people in government that are very openly resistant to this change, there are some people there that are fighting, and part of this research is about trying to get those voices out and get those voices heard. Yeah, so moving on to talk about our research then. If I can find, here we go. That's the point of our research, is to uncover those people, uncover what's really going on, what the true story is for life in Belize, because as you've probably gathered so far, it's been a pretty big onslaught of negatives. But to discover what the true lived experience is for sexual and gender minorities, and explore particularly how that works in the different sort of topic domains. So in terms of socio-economic development and government, what challenges are they facing there? What areas for change are there? So want to put a positive spin on the work we're doing and talk about, okay, so this is the situation, where do we go from here? What are those kind of points for change that we can look at now? Where can we go from this? Rather than just being like, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad. But yeah, and essentially, as you'll have seen in the Morocco talk earlier this morning, ultimately we want to make recommendations. We want to highlight those points of change, and we want this to gain traction. So again, it goes back to that work we've done with our partners in Belize. This research for them, they need to own this. Who can work with us, they can own it, and we hope it points them in the direction to look at for kind of further work. So to talk about our methodology, as I just said, it's really essential having that element of co-production and working with our partners. And we want this survey to be guided by their insights. So we wanted to really focus on what they feel the key issues are. And because of that, in order to do that, we had a lot of kind of consultation meetings with them, which, as I'm sure everyone's familiar with the difficulties of Zoom, international Zoom, it's not always easy, but we got there in the end. So yeah, really important that they helped steer us in the direction we wanted to go. And it was structured thematically around the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So again, if anyone was in the Morocco talk, they touched on it. I should have put a slide on, but I didn't. But we really wanted this to cover kind of thematically align with the SDGs. Obviously, it helps in terms of policy recommendations as well, to have that alignment with the SDGs, and again, that positive emphasis on we're working around those complexities and those intersectionalities, and what those kind of focal areas we want to look at are. So absolutely important for that reason that our survey covered topics such as food availability, education, police and kind of legal institutions, healthcare, violence, religion, etc. So you'll kind of see as I go through the results, that's sort of the order that we've got there. Survey was voluntary, it was online, so again, elements of self-selection was required, kind of inevitable, can't really get around that unfortunately, but was it was quite long as well. We had 98 questions. So I mean, it was really important, as with anyone that's done kind of survey research, there's a bit of a trade-off between how much detail can I get and how interested can I get people to stay in doing this. But we kind of thought we need to ask questions in detail here. We need to get a really clear picture of what's going on. So obviously it was quite long, but I think it was worth it in the end to kind of get the level of depth that we got in the results there. And it was open to anybody who was Belizean who self-identified as a sexual or gender minority. So they didn't actually have to live in Belize. I think most of our respondents did in the end. They were all Belizean, all kind of local, but yeah, no restrictions on who answered it. So we wanted everyone's voice in there. Here's a few examples of our kind of outreach. We had a few challenges along the way in terms of outreach. Again, with the nature of it being an online survey, trying to get people to kind of understand what the work is and do it whilst we're all sat at home in the UK. In my case, little sleepy East Yorkshire, trying to get people in Belize to do a survey is not the easiest task. We had to use a lot of kind of social media. I had to send a lot of nice emails to people in Belize, to kind of companies that were known to be LGBT friendly, that kind of thing. But we did get there in the end. And obviously our partners, our circle, were really instrumental in this. We relied a lot on their help and their expertise in kind of distributing the survey as well across their networks. So a few different poster variations there if you're interested. So in terms of our key demographics, I'll just run through these a little bit to contextualize the results that we got, but pretty much a third of our respondents were gay men. So it's really interesting because actually half of the respondents were cis women. So slight discrepancy there, but yeah, kind of please consider when we go through the results, a lot of this is the experience of gay or lesbian people, slightly less so the experience of trans and intersex peoples, which I'll talk about in a second. Age range was a range, but mainly young adults. So I think actually half of our participants were aged between 19 and 30. So that kind of probably in their 20s, sort of early stages of adulthood when you're kind of first finding your feet. There were a few sort of just under 20% in age sort of 30 to 35, and there were a few outliers slightly older and a couple of people slightly younger, but again, please consider the results in the context of young adults and life experiences specific mainly to this group. In terms of where they lived, it was mainly rural, mainly urban again. So in terms of, as I said at the start, in terms of Belize as a country, although it is mainly a rural country, most of our results were concentrated. I think people actually who live within Belize City, which again is where our circle are based, so probably not that surprising, but again, something just to consider. And interestingly, the majority of people were religious as well, so actually half of them were Roman Catholics, and the majority did all cite some religion, and then half of those people were Roman Catholics. So it's possibly, I found that quite surprising from my own naivety. I was thinking, well, if religion in the church is kind of so hostile, why are they religious? But it kind of shows the level to which the church, and particularly Christianity and Catholicism, is enshrined, sort of ingrained within society, and therefore just what a huge barrier it must be to be not accepted and rejected by that institution. And finally, as well, across the sample, it's clear that a lot of people were really highly educated. I think the majority to a university undergraduate level, some even beyond that. So again, really positive, as I'll go on to say, there's various barriers that we've come across in the experience of sexual and gender minorities in education. So it's really positive to see that even in spite of these barriers, a lot of people are still getting through to those high levels of education. And also a lot of the majority of those people, I think 63% or something, did study within Belizean institutions, so Belizean universities. So again, positive to see that they're persisting and that they're able still to access education. So I think I've mainly touched upon most of these, but of course, as with any sort of survey research, particularly research done by volunteers, there's of course some inevitable sort of limitations. For us, the obvious one is the sample size. We really wanted at least over 100, but ended up following all of the kind of analysis and sifting through data and stuff, we've ended up with 50. But that's still positive for us. We know, obviously, in terms of academic studies, people might say, oh, that's not a very big sample size. Obviously, it can't generalize to the entire population of sexual and gender minorities in Belize. We know that. But we're proud that we've still captured those voices of Belizeans, and that's the point of this work. So anything is a bonus, even if we only got one person and we got their voice and their experience. For us in this work, that's a bonus, and it's really positive. And to be honest, 50 people, considering we're mainly a bunch of people sat in the UK, we're trying to talk to our circle and Tarisha over Zoom, trying to organise this. We're really proud of that. It's quite a big achievement for us. So yeah, slightly small sample size, so consider please as I go through the results, they're kind of possibly not fully generalizable. And then obviously there's the issues possibly again with representation, so the representativeness of the result of within this smaller sample, as I touched upon. It was mainly an urban sample, people mainly lived in the city, so obviously their experience is going to be completely different possibly to those people that live in kind of rural areas, in rural villages. The kind of community dynamics may change as well, so that's something to bear in mind. And similarly, the age of the sample as well. We've got mainly young people, and that's brilliant. It's really insightful to kind of see how their lives are like, but again, it would be great to get the voice of some of those older populations. We see some of the results I'll discuss. You can kind of see, oh, that makes sense because the majority of them are probably in their 20s and they probably still live at home or they live with their friends. So it helps. It's helpful just to contextualize some of our results there. And again, small intersex and transgender sample size. I think I already mentioned that, but just something to consider as well with some of the results we've got going forward. This could be a completely different story if we had more people from a transgender or non-binary or intersex community. You know, their kind of level of unmet need could be different, so it's important just to recognise that. Oh, and finally, there's obviously an unavoidable element of digital exclusion there as well, as with any kind of online survey. Unfortunately, there's nothing we could do about that. But again, I think possibly fitting with the idea of outreach with more rural populations, we see that as a positive in terms of that's an area that we could work on in the future. Perhaps that's something that our circle located in Belize can look at and work on themselves to kind of work on those kind of rural voices and rural experiences there. So to go through our results then, I've presented here on the next few slides the kind of headline key findings. They're presented in the order that matches the report. So I should say our report is not yet published, but is hopefully will be published imminently, and the results here are kind of the headlines that I've picked out of that. So again, for in terms of stats and percentages and that kind of thing, that level of detail will be more so in the report. I'm just going to kind of talk through it. So first off was food and nutrition, which again, in terms of thinking about the SDGs there, food and nutrition, access to not only food, but is it nutritious food? Is it sufficient? Is it adequate? Really important to look at. Unfortunately, we found that nobody said they didn't have access. So there was no one there that could not access sufficient and nutritious food. However, we did kind of then realise, well, even though no one said they don't have access, actually only 29% of participants said they always had access. So actually, when you look at that, possibly still an area to work on there, because it actually means that over 70% of people, therefore, that did our survey, access to sufficient and nutritious food was not necessarily guaranteed or constant. So again, something to think about there. In terms of employment and finance, excuse me, 52% live on less than $800 a month, yet over 60% of them are in full-time paid employment. So slight discrepancy there in terms of the actual how much people are earning. Really positive, at least, that there are a lot of, the majority are in full-time paid employment. And again, interesting to think about in terms of, if I go back to the demographics of our sample, the majority are educated to a degree level. It's some beyond that. So some of these people have master's degrees, even PhDs, and yet they're earning, some of them will be earning less than $800 a month. So something kind of, there's clearly kind of subtle complexities to this that would be interesting to look more into. Housing and accommodation, I think this is the key one I was thinking of when I said the age of the sample size may really skew the results on this, because we did find that only 1 in 4 owns their home. So the majority of our respondents were renting or living with friends or family, but then I think the majority of them were also in their 20s. That's probably pretty normal. So not that unsurprising. 12% did live in kind of semi-permanent housing, so what we meant by that was sort of slums or barracks. But luckily, even for those people, none of them said that they didn't have access to adequate facilities. So everybody, at least whatever their living situation, did say they had access to kind of sufficient clean water, electricity, internet, toilets, that kind of thing. So in terms of sort of public health and sanitation, that's the positive. And then climate change and the environment. If anyone's just been to Drew's talk, I shouldn't bother because it's all in his talk, but that was a really interesting one for me. That's really changed my perception of how we think about climate change. So this was really illuminating to see people's responses. So for this question, change it. They had the chance to write an answer to this one. It wasn't just a kind of Likert scale. And we can see sort of common themes in their answers centered on how climate change can exacerbate and escalate prejudice, discrimination, and inequalities already faced by sexual and gender minorities. So it's really illustrating, as you can see, of how, again, Drew's just said it, so I'll be brief on this, but how it's so interesting to think of, but also so essential that we think of things like climate change in terms of these big complex problems, and we think about how they can massively worsen these kind of discrimination and stigma experienced by sexual and gender minorities, essentially already contributing to it and worsening those structural determinants of pre-existing inequalities. So this is just a really nice example of that on the board here. So someone said, if a drought or something similar would happen, disabled and or queer people are the first to be let go. So again, it's those marginalized communities, which of course is always unfortunately going to be the queer people in society. Those people living on the periphery, experiencing those multiple discriminations, but in this case, if a flood would happen, people would be displaced. Queer people, for example, those who did have homes, who did own their homes, and they did have a safe place to stay, would no longer have that. They'd all suffer from the same disaster, but now they're all placed alongside the homophobic people that they're trying to escape from. There's no walls to separate them. So again, as Drew was saying, you've got to think that we're all suffering here from the same problem, the same climate disaster, but some people it's 10 times worse with the healthcare access, the kind of amenities access, the fact that, as with COVID, as they mentioned, that you would then have to live, perhaps you'd have to move home to family who used to beat you up. So those kind of multiple discriminations create that kind of intersectional nature of this. So important that we keep that at the forefront of our minds. And as you can see, I've highlighted this as climate change, obviously SDG 13 as well. So again, super important in terms of those sustainable development goals, really key focus here for queer people. So moving on to physical, mental and reproductive health. So people generally rated their physical health as fairly good, generally okay. However, this did reveal that there were unfortunately a lot of barriers and obstacles to accessing healthcare, which, as we know from sort of general public health studies, those barriers and discriminations within healthcare tend to result in disproportionately worse outcomes for sexual and gender minorities in terms of their physical health. So thinking about health in terms of not just someone's physical health, but also the health settings and the accessibility of health settings and inclusivity within them, so important, and always has that kind of intersecting element to it. So unfortunately, this was actually a quarter of people personally, directly had experienced some form of discrimination, often at the hands of actual staff in those healthcare settings. So in some cases, as I mentioned earlier, with the kind of sexual health, it could be the fact that nobody's trained them to work with and support sexual and gender minorities, and because of that, there's kind of consequent discriminations that they face. Or it could be explicit use of derogatory language and that kind of stigma surrounding the settings as well. So a clear area there is healthcare that needs addressing. It also has quite strong links to legislation as well. So if you remember when we spoke about transgender people as well, the fact that, for example, name change is not possible, or having kind of gender markers, for example, in terms of your legal documentation is not allowed. Imagine your experience of going to a hospital and filling in sort of hospital paperwork and medical insurance and that kind of thing. So it builds a picture of how those discriminations build on top of each other there. Mental health also was mixed. Generally, people sort of said they're okay, but of course, as often happens, unfortunately, among sexual and gender minorities, there's again disproportionately higher levels of anxiety and stress often mentioned. So again, that's an area to look at. And reproductive services, luckily, that's quite positive numbers. 83% have access, but another area to work on is that over a quarter of those who need it said they weren't able to access the healthcare they needed. So possibly this could be different if we were to look more at the experience of those transgender, intersex and non-binary individuals. If we had more of their voices left, more of their voice within this sample, that could be a different story. Let's start doing that. Physical abuse and torture, heartbreakingly, does seem to happen. Slightly ambiguous as to the extent of this, but 3 people did share with us their personal experiences. So as you can see on here, it's seen each of those was pertaining to conversion therapies propagated by the church and kind of religious figures in their life. Again, to do with that kind of idea of homosexuality against as perverse to natural law and kind of moral sin. So a clear area there that we need to focus on and highlight with immediate action. And then social attitudes again pertains a lot to discrimination. So in multiple settings, such as the workplace, for example, unfortunately, there's a lot of cases of kind of discriminatory practice, such as unfair dismissal, hiring, firing practices, gender pay gaps, and that kind of thing. Discussed as well, obviously, healthcare settings is key, but also kind of housing as well, in mortgage denial, for example, unfair evictions. So clearly it just goes to show how important that equal opportunities bill is, how important it is to kind of keep fighting for that, to get that passed so that we can have those kind of discrimination protections ratified. These are a few examples of discrimination actually that our respondents said happens even in school. So it seems to start from an early age and be sort of propagated even within state institutions, even from kind of school age. So again, you can see kind of religious links there. And finally, sort of violence and safety as well. There seem to be a few issues with police brutality. So, as you can see on the board here, this is a few quotes from our survey of examples of kind of direct discrimination from the police and officers of the law, either within police custody settings, as was the case with Ulysses, or actually just on the street, kind of unprovoked harassment, discrimination. So clear, as we've seen, there's clear elements of kind of embedded, institutionalized discrimination that really need to be addressed here. So that's led us to our conclusions and recommendations, which is that essentially in Belize, it seems that ultimately, whilst they have overturned the section 53, so they have decriminalised homosexuality, there's obviously a lot more that needs to be done from a kind of legislative level to kind of get this to filter down into that, building that community and social change. So key settings, obviously there's massive barriers, as we've discussed, in healthcare, education, mainly to do with accessibility and inclusivity. So again, if we address that discrimination protection from that kind of state legislation level, that will hopefully filter down into improving people's safety and experience of those settings. Destigmatization as well across the settings within society. There's a lot of work needed to change the kind of perceptions of sexual and gender minorities in the media. So as you saw from some of that pro-heterosexual rhetoric, that's obviously not helping. Need to address that and need to help raise public awareness of sexual and gender minorities, improve their safety and inclusion within public spaces and public messaging. And then there's kind of the immediate hard action that needs to be taken to address kind of horrific examples of brutality and torture. So obviously police brutality, conversion therapy as well. So kind of immediate investigation, formal investigation is necessary to look into this and hopefully get that reform as soon as possible. And just to finish, we asked people, of course, what change they'd like to see, and this is some of their quotes. So essentially, all they want is to be accepted in society, to be respected, as we saw earlier, to have a family, to be happy and not be judged. So there's clear areas there for social change and clear pathways that we can take to addressing this and hopefully building up that society in the future.
Questions. But if you do you have any questions? Would you be okay, like, if anyone wanted to email you?
Yeah, of course. I'll be hanging around as well in the coffee break.
Okay.
So feel free to chat.
So if anyone would like to catch Chloe in the coffee break or email any questions over, that would be fine. We've got a 15-minute break, and our final talk will start at 3:45. So I'll see you back here soon. Oh, sorry.
Eloquent, amazing, you did so well. Super proud. That was brilliant. This was meant to be 3, and you put all this together. You were brilliant. You just did that flawless. Really happy. I've photographed a couple of them. I sent one to Bill. I said, Bill, she's brilliant. You're welcome.
I'm sorry
No, it's all right. Did you enjoy it? Oh, cool. Ah, cool. Jim, the room was brilliant.